Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Harding. I'm going to be walking you through activity 1.1b today. You can find that in your class notebook. You should have already completed the intro activity and activity 1.1a, where you learned about different types of variables, quantitative and categorical. And then also you learned about how to display categorical data and what would make something an appropriate display versus an inappropriate display. What we're going to do in section 1.1b is that we're going to actually look at the comparison of two categorical variables to determine whether there is an association between them or if they are independent. And you can see on the screen what the learning targets are. From a two-way table of counts, answer questions involving marginal and conditional distributions. Describe the relationship between two categorical variables by comparing the appropriate conditional distributions, and construct segmented bar graphs to display the relationship between the two categorical variables. So if you scroll to, apologize for my screen flipping there. If you scroll to the opening activity, what you see there is a picture of the Titanic. We all know about the Titanic. What we're going to take a look at, though, is we're going to take a look at whether or not the ticket any passenger held had any kind of association with whether or not they survived when the Titanic sank. So that's two categorical variables that we're looking at. We're looking at what ticket class they held, and then we're looking at whether they survived or not. And the way that you often display information for two categorical variables is in something called a two-way table or a contingency table. And you can see in the activity that one has been created that shows the counts of people that fit each criteria. So for example, there were 203 people that were in first class and survived when the Titanic sank. There were 118 second class people who survived when the Titanic sank. And then what's missing in the table, and I have filled in mine, is the totals in the rows and in the columns. So if you total across, there are 711 people who survived the Titanic. These numbers on the outside have a special name. This is called the marginal distribution. So if you look at the last column, 711 people survived, 1,490 people did not. This is called a marginal distribution of survival. Likewise, in the very last row, you have 325 first-class passengers, 285 second, 706 third, and so on. These numbers along the bottom are called the marginal distribution for class. And it tells you how the tickets were separated by ticket. I'm sorry, how the tickets were separated by class. So if you want to pause the video really quickly, you can answer questions C through F. Okay, so in the first couple, C, D, and E, you're just answering based on your contingency table. And then if you look at part F, you had to decide, would you say that second class passengers were more or less likely to survive than third class passengers? Well, there's different things that you could look at. But one thing that we're going to look at is out of the total number of second class passengers that there were, what percent of them survived versus just looking at the third class passengers. This is something called a conditional percentage. So given that they were in second or third class, what is the probability or what is the proportion of people who survived? And so you may have done a calculation something like this to figure out that 41.4% of the second class passengers survived, whereas only 25.2% of the third class passengers survived. So to answer the question based on those proportions, you would say yes, a second class passenger was more likely to have survived the Titanic. There are a lot of different percentages, proportions that you can look at when you're looking at a contingency table. Depending on the scenario, sorry about that, some might be more appropriate than others. But I want you just to pause the video for a second and please answer parts 2A through C. Okay, so compare with what I have on the screen there. I probably shouldn't have showed you the answers first, huh? But each of these represents a different percentage that you could have figured out relative to the second-class passengers that survived. So if you read part A, find the percent of second-class passengers that survived out of the total number of people on board. This is out of the total, 118 over 2,201. This is called a joint percentage. We are looking at meeting the criteria of being a second-class passenger and surviving and seeing what that percentage is out of the total number of passengers on the Titanic. As opposed to part B, which is called a conditional percentage. It says find the percent of second-class passengers that survived out of the total number of second-class passengers. This is a conditional percentage that is based on the condition of being in second class. As opposed to the third, which is a conditional that is based on the condition that you have survived. So find the percent of second-class passengers that survived given all survivors. So out of all survivors that there were, what proportion of them were second class? Now, all three of these can be calculated from the contingency table. Each means just a little bit different. One thing that you really want to pay attention to when you're reading this is what is this total out of? The percent of what? And that will help you distinguish, first of all, if it's a joint percentage or a conditional percentage. And if it is a conditional percentage, out of what total? So in this case, one of the questions was out of all second-class passengers. And then part C was out of all survivors. So you want to make sure and read carefully and make sure that you know what your percent is out of. All of these percentages could be displayed in a table like what you're looking at. It shows all of the conditional and joint percentages for every single cell in the contingency table. But if I ask you to answer part D from the table, what percent of the survivors were in the crew, it might not immediately jump out at you what you're supposed to be looking at. There's a lot of information in this table. So answering D, E, and F, if I asked you to do that, you would most likely go back to the original contingency table to do it. You can check your answers there if you worked those out. So as you can see, all the percentages together in the contingency table can be somewhat confusing. So it's probably better to just look at the original contingency table, not with all of the percentages there. So the big question that we're still trying to answer is, was the chance of surviving the Titanic independent of ticket class? So if we want to explore this and find the most efficient or best way to come to that conclusion, we might want to take a look at things in a different way. So if you flip here to the next page, what has been filled out is something called a conditional distribution. So we talked about marginal distribution. That's the totals and the margins, either along the bottom, which was ticket class, or along the last column, which was survival status. But we can also do something called a conditional distribution. A conditional distribution shows how one variable is distributed over another given variable. So if you look at part B, it says the distribution in the alive row is called a conditional distribution, since it shows the distribution of one variable just for the individuals who satisfy the survival status that they are alive. So what that's showing is that of the people who survived, 28.6% were first class, 16.6% were second class, 25% were third class, 29.8% were the crew. And then, of course, what you're looking at on the screen goes through the conditional distribution of class for those who satisfy the condition of being dead. Now, what are those going to help us with? What we're going to do with those is we're going to create something called a segmented bar graph. And what a segmented bar graph is, it visually displays these breakdowns of percentages. It visually displays the conditional distributions. Here at the bottom, one has been made for the survivors and those who did not survive. And you can see first class passengers that survived, second, third, and crew. And then you can see the same next to it, the conditional distribution for those who died. Now, what exactly is it that you're looking for when you do that? Well, what you're looking for is you're looking to see if the proportions in the distribution are relatively the same or if they are quite different. And we're trying to decide if there is an association between these two categorical variables or if these variables are independent of each other. Now, if they were independent, that would mean that the proportions would be pretty much the same. If they have an association, then there is a difference in the proportions in a segmented bar graph. So take a look at what you see. Would you say that there's an association, or would you say that they are independent? And hopefully you decided that there was an association. You can see the section of the graph that showed first class ticket surviving is much larger than the proportion of first class ticket holders that did not survive. So this is an example that would show that there is an association between the variables of ticket and survival status. Now remember, this is just an association. We can't attribute any cause and effect to anything, but they are clearly not independent of each other. Let's take a look at a different scenario and a different set of data. Here towards the end, it says a survey of 4,826 randomly selected young adults were asked, what do you think are the chances you will have much more than a middle class income at age 30? And if you look at the table, it's broken down into responses by male and female. Based on the survey data, can you conclude that young men and women differ in their opinions about the likelihood of future wealth? Another way to ask that question, is there an association between gender and their opinion on future wealth? And when you look at this table, you can't just simply compare counts. If you look here, almost certain, 486 females, 597 males. Well, there's more males that said they were almost certain about their future wealth. But if you look at the entire survey, there were more males in the survey anyway. So the question really is more about proportion. Did the same proportion of females say that they were almost certain to have future wealth versus males that said the same thing? You can see the answer's already in there. But one way you would do this is through finding the conditional distribution for females, the conditional distribution for males, and then compare the segmented bar graphs. And I can just show you the one with the biggest difference here was those that responded some chance, but probably not. So 426 females responded that way out of 2,367. That is a percent, 18% of females responded that way, as opposed to males, 286 out of 2,459 was only about 11.5%, 11.63, I think. So you can see that there's a difference. It seems that females are more likely to have responded some chance, but probably not, than males did. So we're going to say that they're not independent. There does seem to be an association between gender and opinion.